All right, you are listening to the Linux Zoo Crew episode 32 live. And today we will be discussing drivers in Linux and some of the myths surrounding them. Before we begin today's conversation, I am going to pass the microphone over to the founder of the Linux distro community, Voltam.
Hi, I'm Voltam, founder of the Linux distro community. The Linux distro community is a place for people to hang out and discuss Linux distros, software, and open source. The Linux distro community is a community funded by its members for its members. We are a friendly, welcoming community that encourages people who use Linux operating systems and software to share their passion and knowledge with other people. We believe that when people share information freely, everyone benefits. We'd love to see you become a part of the Linux distro community. You can voice chat with us on Mumble or text chat with us in IRC. Head over to linuxdistrocommunity.com for details. Join in today in the sharing of knowledge and the freedom that a Linux operating system gives people. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Voltam. And now I'm going to pass the mic to Total OS today, who will introduce all of the guests on our panel.
Alrighty, Spatry, thank you. We have Iron Claw, Matthew Moore. Oh, hey, it's Lou. Shaggy 2Dope, of course, Spatry, and myself, Toss today.
Yeah, and this is a real treat to have Oh, hey, it's Lou on the show. How you doing, Lou?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, you got an awesome show, lots of good stuff going on, and guess what, Iron Claw, he is up and coming, he is putting out videos, he's working on this like a madman, he's putting up videos to teach you guys how to get gaming done right in Linux. Tell us about it, Iron Claw.
Well, let's see, I just put up, I think, my 5th game video. It was Wing Commander 3, which is the DOS version you can get off of goodoldgames.com. And it uses DOSBox, of course. And, God, you put me on the spot here. I don't know what to say.
No, that's okay, but I'll tell you what. That Wing Commander 3 game, and I saw that piece of video that you put up, and I was thinking to myself, geez, I got to do that now that you've put that up, because that game was, bar none, one of my favorites. It is an oldie, but it is a classic. Also, guys, it's not too late to get in on the August 15th drawing on the Linux distro community. There will be a link in the show notes where you can go onto the Linux distro community forums and sign up to win the Samsung solid state hard drive. I believe it's a 128 gig hard drive, and it's an internal device. And, you know, these internal hard drives are a lot faster than the standard hard drives. Matter of fact, don't even bother, because then that gives me a better chance of winning, because I want this new drive. All right, and now we're going to talk about drivers, realities, and myths in Linux. Now, as many of you know, we have pretty good driver support, in most modern Linux distributions. Pretty much, it'll run most hardware that's out there without having to really install any proprietary software. With the exception on my computer that I'm running now, I had to install a proprietary driver to get the wireless working. But I was able to actually get it to work. But everything else on the system works perfectly. And, this is just something that I've seen in just the past 2 years, that these kernels are coming out, and they're bringing a lot of innovations to Linux, in that, you can now run a Linux system on your computer without having to install anything. And that is one of the myths out there, is that there is no driver support in Linux. We'll start off with you, Iron Claw. How do you see that?
Well, I can definitely contrast the past to the present, since I've been using Linux for almost 20 years now, and things have definitely changed. And nowadays, there's a lot more support. I mean, like the only driver I had to actually install on my desktop system was the video driver, because it has an NVIDIA card, and I wanted the 3D acceleration. Other than that, it worked out of the box. My laptop the same way, right out of the box.
In your time of using Linux, Iron Claw, did you ever have any hardware that was difficult to get working, where you had to install proprietary drivers, or, did you run into any bumps in the road?
Oh, all kinds. If you're looking back to, 90, 95, 96, 97. Oh yeah, there was all kinds of stuff that didn't work then. I mean, pretty much then the only thing I could guarantee was going to work when I installed it was the floppy drive and the hard drive.
And I'll have to agree with you there, because in the 90s I did try some Linux distributions myself. Namely, there was one point I tried Red Hat. I also tried an earlier version of Mandrake and an earlier version of SUSE. And I would have to agree that things didn't work that well. But, when I switched to Linux 2 years ago, I tried Mint and everything worked out of the box. So, yeah. Matthew, your turn.
Well, for the most part, I haven't had too many driver issues with Linux. My current computer now, an Asus X54C, I did have an issue with the SM bus controller not working properly for thermal monitoring, but some editing in a config file took care of that. As far as drivers not working, my Dell laptop has a Broadcom Wi-Fi card, and that thing almost never works. But for the most part, it's been pretty positive for me.
What do you think, Toss? Do you think we need to call Linus Torvalds and ask him to give Broadcom the finger?
When you say drivers, Patrick, do you mean all drivers?
Drivers in general.
Well, I think
we're going to get him started on ATI now. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that NASCAR driver Danica Patrick is. Oh wait, that's a different driver. Sorry. Let me say this, and I'll be serious for my newbie channel, for beginners, for those out there. In my experience lately, 90% when you install an out-of-the-box system, and I also like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Zorin, 90% plus, as far as drivers go, you are going to be fine. The two things that I have had trouble in the past are video drivers and printer drivers. Printer drivers, not more so now, it's more video drivers. In the past, I have I've given my own finger to, video drivers, especially those for the ATI. But for the most part, Spatry, I would say, and you don't really, unless you want to do gaming, which I don't, you really don't have to install what I call the extra drivers that may possibly, and I stress possibly, mess up your system. But for the most part, 90% plus, if you're a Windows user, want to try something, you should be okay with most drivers.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there. Gaming is a big thing. Here's one of the myths I was reading online that's related to what we're discussing right now, in that, quote, Linux requires you to know a lot about your hardware. It is a geek's system. And the reality of it is, there was some truth to this claim in the early days of Linux. It's certainly not true now. You can be quite hardware phobic and still enjoy Linux. At the same time, if you're the kind of person who enjoys getting the last ounce out of your discs or video card, Linux provides excellent tools for doing so. Let's pass this over to Oh Hey It's Lou and share us your thoughts on this.
Sure, thanks, Patrick. When it comes to drivers, I think that the impetus has always been placed on Linux itself, and I think that's just a wrong perspective. I was listening to an interview with Linus recently, and someone asked him the question, when it comes to driver support in Linux, does he find that to be a difficult task? And Linus himself said it's not difficult to support PC hardware itself. What's the hardest thing to support is everything that looks into the PC. And so when you kind of think about how drivers work, Microsoft, for instance, Microsoft doesn't write the drivers for every piece of Windows software itself. You've got developers of these different pieces of hardware, the hardware manufacturers rather, writing their own drivers. However, when it comes to Linux, I think people fail to remember that. They put all the imps on Linux itself to have to develop and reverse engineer drivers for hardware that they're not manufacturing. So, it becomes a challenge at times to support the hardware, but it's not Linus's job to try to reverse engineer drivers for hardware he's not manufacturing. So for the other ecosystems and operating systems like Apple and Microsoft, they have different hardware manufacturers handling the driver support, whereas in Linux, the Linux kernel developers are handling driver support for all the hardware, which is completely opposite of all the other operating systems out there.
Well, I couldn't have put that better myself. Good one there, Oheitsu. And this is another myth, right along the same vein of what we're talking about. This myth states, quote, a lot of hardware doesn't work with Linux, and the reality is some hardware doesn't, as in answer to what Stripe mentioned on IRC, that he has some hardware that does not work properly. You're most likely to have problems with internal modems or wireless network cards, but as the Linux market grows, it becomes more and more worthwhile for manufacturers to write Linux drivers, as well as Windows drivers for their devices. Typically, these are supplied in compiled form and only on some Linux distributions. Debian in particular will not include them on principle, but you can download them from the manufacturer's site if you need them. And some distributions, like Ubuntu for instance, make a point of including proprietary drivers for commonly used hardware where no open source driver is available. We still haven't heard from Shaggy, so let's go ahead and pass the mic over to you. How you doing, Shaggy?
I'm doing great. Everything that everyone said needs a little bit of a citation to it. You have to take every piece of hardware for what it is. Intel stuff. A lot of Intel devices are actually supported by Intel. They're one of the major contributors to the kernel, period. But then some don't do it at all. NVIDIA is infamous for this. They can be more open, but they choose not to. It's up to the companies, but it's also up to the user. You can't complain about, you can't go out and buy a car, then buy an alternator from the wrong model and expect it to work. The same thing with an operating system. There are computers out there that are intended to be used with Linux. There's some that are even certified for Ubuntu and other distributions. They're not always the most ideal system, sometimes a little bit more expensive, but you have to go out there out of your way to buy something if you intend to run something. You can't just slap it in there and hope it works. The user needs to take some accountability for what they decide to do. You need to buy a system that's like System 76 or something, that it's known to work on Linux and works really well. If it runs Ubuntu, it can run other distributions as well.
Absolutely. Now, guys, let's have a quick look at the flip side of the coin. Okay, let's say you went out and you purchased this really nice, let me pick a brand off the top of my head. Let's say you bought a Canon printer for your Windows computer. You were running Windows XP when you purchased this printer, okay, and now you have upgraded your system. Now you're running Windows 8, and now all of a sudden that printer no longer works, okay? So, and the manufacturer may decide, okay, well, we're not going to make a driver for that new Windows 8 operating system, obviously, because now we have a better printer that we have manufactured, arguably better, to get people to go out and purchase that newer printer. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that we can run older hardware such as printers or other peripherals, and it doesn't matter, well, I think there is some degree of, because the newer kernels do, outmode older hardware and that sort of thing. But the thing is, we can expect longer life out of the hardware that we use in Linux. We'll start with you, Ironclaw.
Oh yeah, I've definitely run systems into the ground where the hardware has died, but right up till the end it worked just fine under Linux, and I don't know if I had put Windows on it how well it would have worked. And in fact, I can't speak on Windows 8. I have never run it on a machine myself. I can't speak on anything newer than Windows 7, but for instance, my webcam wouldn't work under Windows 7. Works just fine under Linux.
Yes, and that's an issue that I experienced. We have, my mom has an older Logitech webcam that will not run on Windows 7. But the thing is, I was able to plug this into Linux Lite, which she is now running. And yes, kids, we're eventually going to get Mom on the show to show off her Linux operating system. But we were able to actually get that old webcam working in a modern Linux distribution where it just would not work properly in Windows 7. Matthew, we're going to pass this over to you now.
Well, I want to add one thing about drivers being available longer on Linux than they might be on Windows. There's also one more thing that you can take into consideration on that even though they're older drivers, because they're open sourced, not only are they still being supported, they're also still being maintained and updated in a lot of cases, where on Windows you won't have that. Once the manufacturer no longer supports a driver on Windows, well, that's pretty much it. On Windows, even the old stuff is still going to be updated if people are still using it.
Lou, what you got?
I think Shaggy brought up a really good point. When you're making hardware selections, you need to really keep your operating system in mind. And a lot of people don't want to have to do that. They want to just be able to go out, buy any piece of hardware they want, plug it into their Linux box, and when it doesn't work, they're cursing Linux. Using Linux is kind of a technology life choice. So with that, certain things, I recently went out, not a few months ago, and I bought an NVIDIA card. I didn't just go and pick up any video card off the shelf without doing my due diligence and research in terms of the Linux support. I went out and made a specific choice, and I did my research. So when I brought that card home and I placed it in my Linux box, and it worked, and I was happy with my decision, and I was pleased with the driver support because I did my research. And the example that you brought up, if you were using Windows for a certain period of time and you had this Canon printer and all of a sudden stopped working, I can definitely see the frustration, and I've had some regressions in terms of hardware in Linux as well, but I've also had it in OS 10. I was an OS 10 user for a long time, and I had it in Windows. But it just comes down to, as a Linux user, I'm more familiar with my PC than I ever was as a Windows user or as an OS 10 user. So I've always been able to use the resources that are available and find workarounds and eventually get it to work.
Now, along that same vein, and you made a good point there too, I had a nice Lexmark printer that I really loved when I was running Windows 98. And when I upgraded to Windows XP, that printer just would not work. And the reason why I said they have a new model or printer that is arguably better, we all know that everything that is manufactured nowadays now has a life expectancy. So, you don't really own the hardware that you're actually running in your home office anymore. It seems like you're now renting it. That printer that you purchased, 10 years ago could probably last you 20 or 30 years with good care, whereas a newer printer that you'll go out and purchase, you'll be lucky to get 3 or 5 years out of it. And along the lines of this discussion, before I pass the microphone over, because this is driver related, this is a common myth. When you ask a question about Linux, you don't get any help. There isn't good information about Linux available. And here is the reality of that. A quick scan to find the answer you are looking for on Google or a short chat in a chat room or forum will dispel that myth very quickly. For example, head over to the Ultimate Linux Newbie Guide forums and ask your questions there, and you'll find there's usually someone on hand and happy to help you. Also the same here in the Linux distro community. I've never seen anybody get bashed in the community for asking a question. There's always people here on Linux distro community, Freenode IRC, that's always willing, able, and ready to help people. And we even have new people that are trying Linux Lite, and we've got the Linux Lite room. And I know I've even taken people into private to help them get some of their video drivers and other things working. So this is a great community, and that myth has definitely been dispelled. Let's go ahead and pass this on to you, Shaggy.
Well, one of the myths that was hinted on earlier is difficult to install Linux drivers or this and that. For the most part, not true anymore. Things have gotten a lot easier, as Ironclaw said. But there are some that takes a little bit more hands-on, and no one should ever feel like There's a difficulty to do it. There's communities out there that are just catered directly for helping people. They want nothing back. They just want to help get other people running Linux. It's fun. There's a community to it. There's not really much of a community, and there's not much of fun in Windows. It's not the same.
Now, the thing is, there are some forums you may go on to, such as well, I hate to say this, but I've seen this on the Arch Linux forums, where a newbie would come in and ask a question, and pretty much people are pretty much giving them the RTFM. You know, did you read the documentation? And of course, the documentation is very well done, but sometimes these newbies don't really know how to work. These newbies don't know where to look exactly, so they decide to hop in on a forum and ask a question. And, you know, so this can sometimes, you know, give the newbie the wrong impression. But it's a good thing that we do have places where newbies can go to get the information they're after, and that sort of thing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to you, Toss.
Well, a good segue for me. Yeah, you know, Toss Today, Total OS Today, I designed the channel really specifically. I mean, it's for everybody, but really specifically for newbies, beginners, you know, dummies. And I say dummies with all the friendship that I can give you. That's just a figure of speech. So, Spatry, it is true. Some forums, some people, when a newbie goes in to ask a question, you know, some of the people, some of the responses, well, this is a family show, so I can't tell you what I think, but you know what I mean. But right. But to the beginners, you are always welcome on the Total OS Today. You know, of course, if you have a question, ask. I will do my best to post a response. Of course, you can ask Spatry. And one thing I will do is, if you have a question and I'm not sure, I will be happy to post a need help video. For example, need help with this or need help with that. And I will just give a shout out to the person out there if you like. I've done that 2 or 3 times and I've gotten responses immediately. So Spatry, yes, some forums may not be helpful. Most of them are. And of course, you and I are always here.
Exactly. And the thing is, I get so many messages on my YouTube channel every day. There's no way I can answer all of them. And a lot of times I'll get questions that I simply cannot answer. And in those cases, what I will do is I will respond to that person. I will approve their message so that it can be seen on YouTube, and then place a message. I don't know the answer to this, but if anybody does know the answer, please respond to, you know, so-and-so so that they can get the answer that they're looking for. Let's go ahead and pass that on to you, Shaggy.
When you run into a lot of people who are read the fantastic manual, you really run into the people trying to just deter people away from using it. You have an elitist attitude with a lot of distros, or even when they shouldn't have an elitist attitude. The Ubuntu forums are fantastic, but sometimes not so much. You have people going, why didn't you go Google this first? Because they don't know how to. You can't expect everyone to know everything. We're new to something all the time. Everyone's new to things. Linux is no exception. Life works that way. But when you have problems with drivers, sometimes the drivers are really difficult. You have ATI cards. People tell them install the ATI driver. Well, is it a legacy device or not? Is it still supported? Because in an instance of ATI, legacy is actually basically saying it's outmoded. It's no longer supported by ATI in any shape or form. They don't support it. So if you get it to work, it works. If it doesn't work, they're not going to fix anything. But that's not the same across the board for all Linux drivers. If you run into a problem with, say, the USB devices, you could get on the Linux mailing list and you can get some actual conversation going with the developers. A lot of the other, you get the proprietary stuff out the window. A lot of the Linux drivers, you can actually communicate with the developers, which is not something that can be said for Windows.
When it comes to this particular topic, I actually made a video not too long ago on how to install the proprietary NVIDIA drivers in Ubuntu or in an Ubuntu-based distro. And in my intro, one of the things I was talking about was, you know, at times I think we make Linux out to be a lot harder than it really has to. It just takes somebody to show you kind of once or twice on how to get something done. And, you know, that's the whole purpose, I think, that I created my channel. I do see the perspective of some Linux users. When you've got people who don't want to take any time to actually, try to look something up or do a little bit of research, they just kind of want to be spoon-fed the information. I can see how that would get frustrating. However, you've got to know the forum in which, the question's being asked. So if you're on, a help forum and someone has a question, you can't really get mad. I mean, that's what the forum is there for. So you kind of have to know the context in which the question's being asked. You have to, take a lot of things into consideration. And if you're not that person that has a lot of patience to help somebody out, then you probably shouldn't be in that venue where people are asking those questions. But now we've got so many people producing Linux content, especially in an audio-visual sort of way, like you, Spatry, and a lot of other people on YouTube, where it's probably easier than ever now to use a Linux-based system. There's more resources. Again, I've used Windows, I've used OS X, and by far, Linux has the most resources, in my opinion, for troubleshooting and for tutorials and for help guides than any other operating system out there.
Now, interestingly enough, this show actually qualifies Toss today as a Linux A-team because everybody on my panel, with the exception of Shaggy Two Dope, is a YouTube host. Ironclaw has his show with the gaming. Matthew Moore has his whimsical look at Linux and Windows. I loved your Windows 8 review. Oh, Hey, It's Lou has his own show. Shaggy, though, he helped write the documentation for Linux Lite. So, and you see, everybody here on the panel is doing something in the true spirit of giving. One thing that I always say to people is that the greatest gift that you can give to anyone is the gift of your time. And what we are doing here is we are giving back something for what we freely received from the Linux community. And the more people that come in and share that knowledge that they receive, the better it is for everyone, because when this is the same thing that Voltim has said time and time again. When people share, freely, everyone benefits. Yes, and Shaggy was going to say, you teach a man to fish, he has a meal for you give a man a fish, he has a meal for a day. But if you teach a man how to fish, he has a meal for a lifetime. Matthew, your turn.
Well, I wanted to add something about the elitist attitude that you were talking about in the forums and so forth. I've been a victim of that myself in the Ubuntu forums, as a matter of fact. But I think part of that comes from a lot of people that have been using Linux for a long time. They develop a natural ability with their system, and it's second nature. And they forget that there are people out there that don't have the knowledge that they do. And I just wanted to point that out and possibly remind people that do participate in these forums to just remember where you came from and remember that there was a time that you didn't know how to do it either.
Ironclaw.
Well, I got to say, definitely during the time that I've been using it, Linux has come a very, very long way as far as the drivers and hardware support goes. I mean, it went from supporting practically nothing to almost everything, and doing it out of the box, auto-detected, without any kind of user input.
That is the truth. Okay, and we're going to go with final thoughts, and we're going to go in reverse order. We're going to start with Total OS today, and then we're going to end on Ironclaw. And any final thoughts for you, Toss?
Yeah, let me just say that, in some of my videos, I'll sometimes get, shall I say, not too friendly, comments, why you bashing this, why you bashing that. All I can say is jokingly that I am an equal opportunity basher when necessary, both Linux and Windows. But on a serious note, remember that Ubuntu means humanity towards others.
Good point. Shaggy.
Aside from making sure that your hardware will run things, you gotta just be open to suggestion. People will tell you how to do things and how to do stuff. You gotta be open. You gotta be, and you also gotta take the punches. People are gonna jab at you, be like, "Oh, you didn't know how to do this." That's normal. It's perfectly normal. But find a community that you're at home with. There's a lot of small Linux communities that are better than the big forums, the huge Ubuntu forums that you can go to, and you'll find you're more at home, and it's a lot easier. a private conversation on how to do things from people who are familiar with it is always going to do you a lot better than a general masses who are going to tell you, do this, do this, do this. And you didn't need to do step 1 through 5. You need to just do step, 1 through 2. You need to find where you're at home at.
Lou, any final thoughts?
Yeah, Linux is leaps and bounds so far more advanced today than it ever has been. The adoption rate that people are moving toward Linux, and myself personally, having been an Android developer for a while, there's so many people, and with the wide adoption of Android, that are moving to Linux just because of the correlation. With all the resources that there are out there, you've got YouTube channels that are literally created to help you step by step, to kind of hold your hand and to walk you through what it's like to actually use an operating system that's based on freedom. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And there's never been a time, I think, that's more encouraging to use Linux, and there's never been a time that there's been more resources to help you do that. So, if you've been thinking about using Linux and you've been tossing the idea around, find some good support communities like the Linux distro community. Find some good YouTube channels. Subscribe, watch the content. Don't be afraid to ask a question, because once you start using Linux, you're gonna wonder how you went all these years without using it. So.
That's the same thing that I felt myself, Once I was able to get a Linux distribution working 100% to my satisfaction, that is exactly the same way that I felt. Absolutely. Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. Linux is just heaps and bounds ahead of where it was even a year ago. Things are just, as long as people continue to use it and have a passion for Linux, they're going to go the extra mile to be sure that things work the way they should. And but they need support as well. So as long as you give the developers your support and just give Linux a chance, it will work out for the better in the end.
Iron Claw.
Actually, I the last round I actually did my sum up pretty much.
All right, cool deal. There's one thing, though, that I did not hear, and I want to touch on what was said earlier a little bit, and this had kind of escaped my mind. But some of the things that you can do nowadays, since we all have our little Android or our iPhone devices, we have smartphones, take that tablet, take that smartphone with you to the store when you're going out to purchase hardware that you're going to run Linux on, and find out if people are able to get that piece of hardware working. That's a great resource to have. Google in the palm of your hand is your buddy. And so if you have that with you, and that's something that I do. Anytime I buy anything nowadays, I'll just pull up Google on my device. Although I will admit sometimes my internet connection isn't all that fast. But hey, if it's going to take me 20 minutes to find out while I'm standing in the store aisle, to surf through a few forums, that sort of thing, to find out if this thing is fully supported, by all means, I'll do it before I pull out my debit card, So I hope that'll be a good tip for a number of you people. All right, well, we have had a wonderful discussion. As always, an excellent panel, and I'm glad to have you on the show. Lou, I hope you're going to come back again. Iron Claw, thank you. Thank you, Matthew Moore, for joining us. Lou, Shaggy, and Toss today, thank you, all of you, for joining. Thank you, everybody in the listening room and everybody who participated with us on IRC, and thanks to the Linux distro community for having us here on the show. Now, something I'd like to point out to you guys, I'm not going to be doing a Zoo Crew episode next week, so please be sure to get Spatry on Google Plus, because I announced the Zoo Crew episodes as an actual event. So if you have a Google device, that sort of thing, it'll automatically put that on your calendar on your mobile devices or on your Google Plus account. It'll keep you alerted when we are having the Zoo Crew episodes. So Spatry on Google Plus, just request to be added to my circle. I always add anybody that wants to be in my circles, that sort of thing. And if you want to opt out, just let me know and I will remove you from my circle so that you don't get those notifications. Once again, thank you, all of you, for joining us.
Today's show was brought to you by the Linux Distro Community. Visit us today at linuxdistrocommunity.com and chat with us on Mumble or an IRC on the Freenode network in the Linux Distro Community channel. The Linux Distro Community. Freedom through the sharing of knowledge.